Hi, and welcome back to the second hour of this Tuesday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. You are listening to ethanol-free radio right here on Focal Point and AFR Talk. No corn in our fuel, but we feed you nothing but corn-fed beef, because this is the home of muscular Christianity on conservative talk radio. Taking phone calls on my conversation with Ed Vitagliano from his article in the December issue of the AFA Journal about being morally heroic and how those who are morally heroic can rescue a declining and decaying culture. And I asked the question, are there listeners out there that are willing to be a part of that morally heroic minority? Let's go to CJ in Houston, Texas. CJ, you're on Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
Hey, Brian. Thanks so much for taking my call.
You bet.
Just want to say I appreciate you and the AFR. Kind of new to it, but I love every minute I get to hear it.
Great.
Yes, I am very much on board. And as I kind of see just the direction of our culture, it can be discouraging. But I am an officer in the United States Marine Corps, and just knowing that the position that has, I find myself being very inspired to step up and be an example. And in my pursuing of my girlfriend, as we begin we've started doing premarital counseling along those steps, and just trying to honor the Lord in that. We're both believers in Jesus, and so I try to practice that, I guess, biblical manhood and standing up for what's right, just in all aspects of my life. And I'm not saying I compare myself to other people, but it's got to start somewhere, and someone's got to step up to the plate. And I can't be someone who stands by the wayside and hope that someone else does that. And I've been hearing a lot of lately where people try to blame the church and say, oh, the church needs to step up. And I kind of believe that. I support that partially. But to be more specific, I think men in our culture who believe in the Lord and are followers of Jesus need to step up and not just educate themselves in God's Word, but to also connect their faith with their actions. And I desire to be one of those men, both in the military and in my working sector once I get out, in my marriage, and just once I raise kids, all of that. So I'm very much on board. And thank you for promoting that and sharing everything you have thus far.
Okay, great, CJ. Thank you very much for your call, and thank you for your service. And God bless you and your coming marriage. May God bless you and give you a quiver full of children. Thanks for the call. Appreciate that very much. Let's go to Mark in Huntington, Tennessee. Mark, you're on Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Brian.
Hey.
Well, I'm certainly willing to do my part to, uphold goodness in society in our country. But I thought I would bring up one point. I have some old encyclopedias, and recently I was doing a little research on codes and censorship in America, like back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to wonder what happened to those, and is it possible to reinstate what we had back in those days? I noticed even regarding TV and film, even in like the state of New York or the city of New York City, some films were not even allowed to come into that city.
Yeah, that's right.
They were reviewed by a board. And I just read a lot of stuff on it, and I just wonder what happened to those and so forth. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Mark, and I touched on that just a little bit in the first hour, but in Hollywood, for instance, there were motion picture offices that were run by the Catholic Church and by the Protestant Church, two different film offices, and they reviewed. This was a voluntary arrangement between the Hollywood producers and these film offices, and the Hollywood producers would send every film that they produced to the screeners. And the Catholic Film Office would screen every movie before it went out into theaters. The Protestant Film Commission would do exactly the same thing. And these movies would not go out to theaters until they had been signed off on by both of those offices. That's why you didn't even need a rating system at that time. You didn't need a rating system in 1965 because every movie had been pre-screened, and only movies that reinforced values. I mean, if you can have a movie in which there was an adulterous fling, but there wasn't going to be any explicit sex on screen, and they had to pay for it. You couldn't get away with adultery. You had to pay a bitter price for flouting God's law when it came to monogamy, and they always did. They wound up dead or under a train or shot in the head or something. So sin never paid. The wages of sin is death, and that was taught by every movie that came out of Hollywood. And then I don't know if it's financial reasons. Ted Baer would have the complete story on this, but for one reason or another, these film offices closed down in the mid-'60s. And as I mentioned in the first hour, one of the leading moguls in Hollywood, I don't remember which one it was, but I mean, it was a Selznick, a Goldwyn Mayer type of guy. I mean, that echelon of Hollywood producer went to these film offices and begged them not to close down. He begged them, don't do it, because he knew what would happen when the salt and light. I mean, he wouldn't probably have enough theology to understand it, but Jesus said, the disciples, my disciples, are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Salt arrests the spread of decay. And these guys, maybe they didn't even know that verse and that teaching of Jesus, but they knew that if this restraining influence was taken out of Hollywood, that it was quickly going to descend into garbage, and that's exactly what happened. So, the Roman Catholic Church, for whatever reason, didn't keep that office funded and keep it open. The Protestant Church, for whatever reason, didn't keep that office funded, didn't keep it open. So really, they got no one to blame, but themselves for closing those offices down. And again, I don't know the details there, but the point is, they were a check on what was coming out of Hollywood. When they closed shop, there was no restraint, and we got quickly what we got in Hollywood. You went from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang to My Fair Lady to Sound of Music in 1965. You get to 1969, you've got Rosemary's Baby. You've got The Wild Bunch, which set a new standard for explicit violence on the screen. And you had Midnight Cowboy, nominated for an Oscar, and was the first X-rated movie ever to be nominated for an Oscar. All of that decline, I mean, it happened rapidly. You talk about a fiscal cliff. This was a moral cliff that Hollywood plunged over in 1965, and by 1969, that thing basically was a septic tank. So that is the short version of what happened there. When the salt was removed, the decay sets in. Let's go to Jason, Richmond, Virginia. Jason, you're on Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
I was hoping to ask a question of your guest and about the research.
Yeah.
I tuned in a little late today. I happened to hear when I tuned in about the monogamy thing. I was hoping that he might elaborate on, this. All I heard was that, this monogamy has been identified with the preservation from decay, or that the lack of monogamy was identified with decay. And I was hoping that the guest might elaborate on in this research, how that practically played out, because I don't really, as someone who's been in a polyamorous relationship for a number of years, for 7 years or so, I don't really identify my sexual relationship with people, with any other aspect of my life. It doesn't seem to affect any other aspect of my life. So I was hoping that they might let me know exactly how that worked out, and I'll take my
okay.
The specific ways in which
All right.
a varying sexual relationship cause decay, and I'll take
All right. Okay,
take my
Jason.
reply off the air.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the call. It's a good question. I'll start to answer it. I have to finish answering the question after the break. And by the way, speaking of content in film productions, we have American Family Studios. We started right here at the American Family Association. It's a branch or division of the American Family Association, and that's the commitment of American Family Studios to produce programming, video content that will be uplifting, that will be inspiring, that will be encouraging, that will model and support, defend, and promote the kind of values that we all care about. Now, I'll just start the answer to Jason's question here and then finish after the break. But what happens in monogamy is, number one, there is sexual restraint prior to marriage. So, and that does a lot of good for a culture because it reduces sexually transmitted diseases, for one thing. You don't have people going to the doctor getting penicillin shots every time. And there'll be more when we come back. Focal Point AFR Talk.